All right, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by FLAVA. It is entitled Integrating STEM in the World Language Classroom. My name is Nathan Lutz. I'm the presenter of today's session. I am a French teacher and Global Learning Coordinator at Kent Place School in Summit, New Jersey. I have also taught Spanish in the past, so my examples that I'll be showing in today's webinar will be from French and Spanish classrooms, although I hope that you'll be able to see the value of applying these sorts of things in your languages and at your levels. Currently, I am an elementary language teacher, although we do start very young in my school, so the children are at uh, novice high or intermediate low by the time they do leave the elementary school. So um, a lot of my examples will be elementary school based, although you'll be able to see how you could apply those at the novice and intermediate levels for your older learners in middle school or even high school, and hopefully even walk away with a sense of how you can use STEM in the classroom for your advanced learners, etc. So I've listed here some contact information. I'm very happy to follow up with anybody after today's session. You can tweet me, and you can certainly email me. I've got my email address at the end of today's session. I do have a Pinterest board with some STEM resources in the language classroom. And then you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner, I've also got a website where I have today's session posted, at least the slide deck, and then some other resources that you may be interested in accessing later on. And hopefully you'll find them to be very useful. All right, so for today's session, we're going to talk about content-related world language learning. We'll go through the methodology of doing so. I've got some examples, and I've also got some resources. There will be some opportunities for interactivity throughout the session. That'll give me a chance to catch my breath, but it'll give you all in the various sites an opportunity to process what you've been hearing and think about applying it to your particular learning scenario, which may not be exactly the same as mine, for instance. So for today's session, I'd like us to consider the 5 following learning targets, what I want you to walk away with being able to do. I can state why content-related world language instruction is impactful on student learning. I can choose age and level appropriate themes for my students. I can plan how to implement STEM integrated units. I can lead a Gouin series for an experiment or engineering demonstration. And I can identify sources for leading STEM integrated world language instruction. I always like to start off with a quote, and I take this from Katrina Griffin, the 2017 ACTFL Teacher of the Year, teacher from Maryland. So many of you in the FLAVA organization may know of her, coming from a neighboring state. She came and spoke at the Nell Summer Institute last summer, whose theme was completely devoted to problem solving and STEM as it relates to early language learning. And this was a quote that she said during her talk. She said, "The real essence of STEM is that it is bound together by soft skills, project-based learning, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. These are the 21st century tools that all students need to be successful right now and in the future." And I really love this quote because it really tells us more than just what STEM is. Most people think, oh, that stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. But STEM is really more than that. It deals with integrating those ideas, but an approach to learning so that the learners are collaborating, communicating, using critical thinking, higher order thinking, and approaching whatever they're working on through a project-based learning lens. And all of those are really, really important skills that are going to take them hopefully far into their future. I'm seeing a note that somebody says, should we be hearing something? Um, is there not audio? It looks like there's audio on my end. Can others hear? Could I get an answer if others can hear the webinar? And otherwise I'll continue. Okay, so it sounds like it's just one site that's experiencing difficulty. So hopefully we can get you all up and ready. And there will be a recording of this later on for people to access. So I will just continue to keep us on track with our time. So content-related world language instruction is not at all a new topic by any means. It's been around for years and years. And in fact, in Canada, in their world language system there, it has really been around for quite some time. But there's one thing about teaching the content, and then there's actual, like STEM really involves a, a bigger picture because it integrates so many other things that it's not just one content area, but maybe a couple, and that there's a certain approach to learning, like problem solving, that really requires just a different sort of mindset. It's not just learning facts, but it's learning approaches. But here's some of the research that I have culled that is just really important for us to consider and why we teach that way. And I'll give a little story here. I teach world languages to small children, and I can't go into a classroom and just teach grammar to them because they don't really quite grasp grammar even in their first language. So we have to have something to talk about. So, what do we talk about? Well, I really dislike that old crusty lesson of teaching school supplies because it's just not really relevant to them. It's not intrinsically interesting. It's not motivating. But instead, we talk about things in the real world that get them really interested. So there's a meaningful context for what they're learning about. Another important aspect to consider is that there's some sort of negotiation of meaning. Yes, they are using their interpretive skills to either listen to something or read something or look at something and understand it. But then what do they do with it? How do they apply it? Do they do some sort of interpersonal communication after the fact, speaking about it with another person? Do they do some sort of writing or retelling of it as a presentational mode of communication? That's what we're talking about with regard to negotiation and meaning. There must be comprehensible input. You can't just throw a text at students and expect them to understand it. Instead, you have to scaffold up to it. How do you make that possible? You use a ton of different resources. We're going to look at some of that later on. Real communication is important for our students. They're talking about real things and it's real communication. Speaking or reading or writing in a context that is based in the real world and not something that's static or something that's in a vacuum, not connected to anything in real life. Another important idea to consider is that it's a cognitively demanding as well as intrinsically interesting. Pardon. And this comes from Helena Curtin and Caroline Pizzola, who are just the masters of elementary world languages. Coming out of Canada with Fred Genesee, motivation. When we're learning about content, it's very motivating for students because that there's something that's attached to other areas. Let's say you have a student who is interested in the sciences or in social studies. You're now tapping into that kid's interests. Also, meaningful repetition and recycling of vocabulary. We know as a best practice that we can't teach one thing and then move on and never come back to it, but that the vocabulary or grammar structures that are embedded in that unit constantly come back. And then finally, there must be um, support that we support student understanding of academic and Common Core standards. This is a favorite graphic of mine. It's Dale's cone of experience, and it really opened up my way of approaching how I work with my students. In fact, at one of the positions that I held, the head of school always included this graphic in the onboarding documents that new teachers received because it's really how he wanted us to think about our teaching. So if you look in the middle, those are the various types of activities that one might do in a classroom. And then on the left-hand side, there's a correlating number, a percentage, telling us what percent of people generally remember what they've done according to the activity that's in the middle. And then off to the right, we have what people are able to do after the fact, the learning outcomes. So if we look up at the very, very top, the tiniest part of the pyramid, it says when students are reading, they're only going to retain 10% of what they read. And as we move down, the pyramid broadens in its size, and we see that there's greater retention. So then what students hear, there's a little bit more retention there. Viewing images, watching video, it's even greater. Attending an exhibit or looking at sites, watching a demonstration, going all the way down to where they are designing or performing presentations and doing the real thing. And that's over 90% of people recall or retain what they've learned. So if we think about this in terms of the classroom, it's really hands-on experience is what is going to help students retain the most of what they've been learning. And then if you look off to the right side where it says what people are able to do after the fact, the learning outcomes, you see that we've got those higher order skills like analyzing, designing, creating, and evaluating. Those really, really important skills. So I apologize that this might look a little small on your screen, but it's basically a type of web where we have the theme that we're working on in the middle, and radiating out from it are all the different types of subject areas that could be attached to a certain theme. And we're going to now consider uh, the STEM topics of science, technology, engineering, and math. Some people in their academic institutions add in an A for the arts, some others add in an R for reading. We're going to just say STEM out of simplicity's sake today, but if you want to include the A and the R in your uh, learning context, go for it. So I've already rattled these off several times already, but it's, as I've hinted, it's not just science or technology or engineering or math on their own when we're talking about STEM, but it's really the integration of one or more disciplines in order to solve real world challenges. It's not that we're considering something that's artificial, that's not attached to the real world, but that there's a genuine uh, motivating factor of why this thing must be solved. So I'd like for you now to turn and talk in your various sites where you are. And I'd like for you to talk about what are some of your favorite STEM topics that you currently teach, if you happen to do that. If not, maybe talk about ones that you'd be interested in. So what I'd ask the site coordinators to do is if you could type into the chat box, we'll just take a couple, like maybe a minute or so for you to do this and just popcorn out some answers to the site coordinator to type it into the box. All right, you have 1 minute. All right. So looks like we've had a few responses. You can keep the responses rolling in and you can share them amongst yourselves. But building Roman roads and road equipment, making Roman concrete, life cycle of the butterfly, planets, marine life, animals. All right, lots of answers here. Excellent. Keep them coming in. We really like reading them, and we can definitely share from each other. And I believe we can also retain the chat from this as well. All right. So sounds like a lot of you are already engaged in this sort of thinking, and so I think you can, really refine those projects that you're working on in your various schools and institutions, and um, really make an impact on student learning. So in the next part, I want to talk about why STEM. So there's a couple of different things that come to mind for me. Um, we need to prepare graduates who are skilled in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and a language other than English. There's been some recent uh, advocacy efforts around really promoting more than just STEM as something for a student to be versed in, but also to pair that up with proficiency in a language other than English. We're finding that with the interconnectedness of the world now, that we can't just assume that our interlocutors are going to be English speaking or whatever language we speak, but that we need to be able to not only communicate in another language, to have that cultural competence to work with people from other cultures and other backgrounds, to have that sort of mental disposition and openness to working with people who might have some sort of differences that we just some that monolingual, monocultural people would not be able to come to terms with. Another important reason is that STEM provides real life problem solving skills. It fosters critical thinking, science literacy, and innovation. And then, as I had mentioned in that first bullet there, there's a globally connected workforce. And even though there may not be a sort of parity of using language between two people, just being somebody who has studied languages and cultures would have that cultural sensitivity to work with somebody from elsewhere in the world rather than a monolingual person. So something that I like to talk about when dealing with STEM is that it is indeed standards based in the world languages classroom if we think about the connections standard. The first one is making connections, in which learners build, reinforce, and expand their knowledge of other disciplines while using the language to develop critical thinking and to solve problems creatively. The second standard, acquiring information and diverse perspectives, in which learners access and evaluate information and diverse perspectives that are available through the language and its cultures. So right there, we have a very powerful reason why we can be connecting to content areas such as the STEM fields. I'd also like to talk briefly about the 5 E's of STEM design, which are evaluation, engagement, explanation, exploration, and elaboration. We're going to go through them now. Engagement is where we mentally engage the students with an event or question and help students to make connections with what they know and what they can do. The next phase is explanation, in which students explain their understanding of the concepts and processes they are learning. Teachers clarify students' understanding and introduce new concepts and skills. The next phase is exploration, in which students are working together with hands-on activities, clarifying their own understanding of major concepts and skills. The next phase is elaboration, in which we challenge students to apply what they have learned and build on their understanding of concepts to extend knowledge and skills. And then finally, evaluation. Students assess their own knowledge, skills, and abilities, and it's an opportunity for teachers to assess the learners. Well, these 5 E's happen to match up very nicely with what we use as far as our lesson plan format in my world language program. You'll see on the far left, we have the STEM 5E listed. And then the next column has what portion or what part of the lesson plan in the world language classroom. And then the next column is the type of instruction that's taking place. And then the last has to deal with language acquisition. So you'll see that the first phase of engagement, that could apply to a teaser or an activation or anticipatory set, something that you do in the beginning of the lesson to engage your students. This is beginning instruction. This would be pure input from the teacher. The next phase is exploration, and that could be various experiences of learning via exploration in the classroom. There'd be more input going on, and it's the input intake phase of language acquisition. Next is the explanation phase, where there'd be some sort of a demo and some understanding from that going on. And that's again intake. And then next is elaboration, where there's some sort of application or transfer going on in the language classroom. And this is where we start to get student output. And then the final phase is evaluation. And this would be some sort of evaluation or assessment in the classroom, perhaps with a little bit of student reflection going on. And this would be the output assessment phase of language acquisition. One of the resources that I've placed in the wiki is a link to the next generation science standards. And what I really like about these is that they help us understand what topics and what modalities work best for which learners based on grade level. We don't want to give something that's way too complex for our learners, something that will be over their head, that's out of sequence as far as their learning goes. So if you look at this, this is a second grade lesson or unit on properties of matter. And so for me, when I'm doing my planning, and we'll talk about my process in just a bit, but it helps me understand how I approach it, how I know when it's going to work for my students and when it's not going to work. In my school, we use the Atlas Rubicon curriculum mapping software, and it has been instrumental uh, in our approach for making sure that we plan things that are in alignment with what's going on in their regular classrooms. So we often will access our science colleagues' curriculum maps. This is a fourth grade science one where we can see which units are taught when. Then we can click into these units and see what types of resources are being used by the students. Here you've got a close-up of it where you've got the essential questions. This one doesn't happen to have enduring understandings, but we would hope that that would be in there. The various content areas that are being taught at that time, and then the skills. And then if you were to scroll down, you'd have the various learning activities and the assessment tasks that are being conducted during this unit. What I really like about this type of setup is that, yes, we do have time in our school to meet, but for those times when we don't have time to meet as a team and talk with the other specialists, the science specialists in this case, it helps us really dig in and get to know what is going on. This type of software that we use enables the user to upload and store things. So if a teacher is using particular resources such as videos or certain handouts or graphic organizers, we're able to see them there. Now, I will say we don't reteach what the science or math teachers are doing in their classrooms. We're doing something that's related to the content that they're doing, but we're not an immersion program. We're a plus program. It could easily be a middle or high school language program as well, doing the same thing, but we're not reteaching the same exact content with the same exact things. We're doing something that's related to the same topics and ideas. So that was a fourth grade thing that we were looking at. Now, this is a list of the pre-K topics that we do in our school. When we started the uh, STEM integrated language program at our school, we started at the very youngest levels and pushed it up uh, just so that we could keep it simple on our end. Rather than doing all 8 grade levels all at once, we decided to start at the very youngest and then to gradually move up. So you'll see quite a simplicity of the type of topics that they're working on in the pre-K with the 5 senses in the very beginning of the year. What is fall, the food pyramid, winter animals, ice, shadows, wind, spring, and color. So for those of you who teach high school, you may be more interested in looking at this type of scenario. These are the AP themes. And we, in fact, at my school, align all of our world language curriculum, starting in pre-K all the way through grade 12, to the AP themes so that we can get students thinking about these various topics from a very early age. So the two areas that really stand out for me are global challenges and science and technology. And we know that there is definitely an intersection there where science and technology can help us address some of the global challenges that are out there. So I'd like for you to now do another turn and talk. And this time I think I'll give you 2 minutes to talk about this so you're not feeling so rushed. But I'd like for you to discuss with a partner sitting near you and then eventually share it with your site coordinator. How might you go about planning for using STEM topics in your school setting? What works for you? All right, so take 2 minutes to talk about planning in your school, and then we will get your answers from your site coordinators. 2 minutes starting now. All right, that's been our 2 minutes. So it'd be interesting to read what some of you are suggesting at what might you do for planning about using STEM topics in your school setting. So some people are saying that they are having a bit of a struggle doing this at the university level. And um, I think in that particular instance, you might just need to not consider aligning with, say, the curriculum of other disciplines, but instead developing your own way of thinking or your own curriculum, maybe reaching out to get a little bit of advice from people in the other areas. But when we start looking at some examples, I think that will help uh, inspire something for you to do at your levels. Here we have some people talking about environmental issues, weather patterns, natural habitats, and geography of the target cultures. Very good. And I think even if you just dig into like what are some of the problems, environmental problems, say, um, that various areas that happen to come from your target culture, starting to look at those and seeing what solutions might be going on elsewhere in the world or solutions that your students might come up with. Somebody talking about mining, current events relating to public health, flu epidemic, hunger, environmental issues. Very good. Recycling. Very good. And just really giving, putting some of the onus onto your students and having them come up with uh, ways and approaches to some of these challenges. All right, so if you have some more information that you'd like to type into the chat box, please continue to do so, and we're going to move on. So when we started out with our project, we knew what we wanted to do, start teaching STEM topics in our world language classes, but we needed to understand how we would do that. So what we decided to do first was to come up with a unit plan format that we would use to keep some consistency across units, but that it would also help us make sure that our lessons were steeped in best practices for world language learning. So this is what we came up with. We decided to start off every unit with an enduring understanding. This comes straight from the idea of backward design, where you're just putting up front what you expect your students to walk away with and forever own in their arsenal of knowledge, everything that they are going to keep with them until their adulthood and beyond. And then along the same lines is having some sort of an essential question. We know that essential questions are not questions that are easily answered. They're vast. They have lots of answers. You can talk days and days to answer them. And in fact, I've gotten to the point where I use the essential question as the title of the unit. So one unit that I am very fond of that I do with my kindergarten students, but I've done various iterations of it in other grade levels throughout my career, is how do plants grow? Yes, we could answer that, but it would be, many, paragraphs long to address that sort of thing. But I feel like that's a great open-ended thing that's really going to inspire us to talk about what it takes to, um, for plants to grow. And then we include can-do statements that we craft ourselves that are based on both the language and the content that is related to the particular unit that we're looking at. And then we put the targeted standards for this particular unit. We do both the ACTFL standards for language learning, and then we also put in the next generation science standards if it's a unit that comes from science. And then we have a couple of different lists of the various grammatical expressions that are used throughout the unit, whether they're new ones or whether they're recycled ones. We add in vocabulary, again, whether it's new or recycled, and then list the materials, and then include the various lesson plans. And then we include some sort of a performance assessment in which our students really show off their final learnings from this particular unit. We've moved over to a portfolio type system with our elementary school here at my school, and the performance assessment is put into that. We use Seesaw, which is a really popular tool nowadays. It's very simple for even young learners to use independently, but even the older ones like it too. And what I really like about it is that it inspires collaboration where students will, they can only see the various projects that are in their particular class, but they can look at other kids' artifacts in their portfolios and comment on them. And they can even collaborate on them. So for me, I think that's a really exciting feature because it helps us with that whole idea of collaboration, and they really like looking at each other's work too. That's a really joyful aspect of, of that sort of thing. But the performance assessment in our elementary programs often, I really love to have presentational speaking. And so we have the students do recordings of them talking about whatever they've worked on. Sometimes it's a 3D thing they've done or some sort of a picture. But for me, it's really them talking about what they've produced. And it's an opportunity for them to sort of have that crutch, that physical object there to help them discuss whatever they need to talk about. And the other great thing about Seesaw is that I'm able to keep these recordings and have students look back at them over time to look at their progress. So right now I'd like to do another turn and talk, and I'm going to give 2 minutes again for you to work on this. Please cite hosts, please type in the answers that some of the attendees will give you. So the question that I want you to consider right now for the next 2 minutes is, what are some barriers to teaching STEM topics in the target language? All right, you have 2 minutes to talk about barriers to teaching STEM topics in the target language. All right, great. Thank you for providing with lots and lots of answers there. Before we talk about these barriers to STEM teaching in the target language, I just wanted to talk about some of the challenges overall that teachers might face, and then we're going to come back to them. So, one major challenge could involve training. If you have been trained to be a world language teacher, you may not be up on the latest trends in science or math or technology and engineering. You might read about some of these challenges in the target language and be very proficient at reading them and understanding them. But to really understand what is going on may not necessarily work. I got in trouble with a science colleague because of the way that we were talking about matter and the way that I was depicting a gas in a certain drawing was a little bit not exactly right according to science. I still don't think I quite understand what I did wrong, but there is that possibility that we might make some gaffes because we don't have that training because we did not go to school to be scientists or mathematicians. So there is that. Now, I do have to say, those of us in the elementary school might have an easier time of this than, say, teachers at higher levels, high school or post secondary, where the science content would be more rigorous and have just greater depth and more nuances that a language professional may not quite understand. And that goes along with the content knowledge as well. Another challenge could be that you don't have the materials. If all of your funding is for uh, traditional world language materials or even just books, you may not have what it takes to do some engineering experiments or some science experiments in your classrooms. What's interesting is I had applied for a grant from my state world language organization, and they were really eager to give the grant, but in the process, I did get stopped and asked, well, can't you just borrow that from your science department? And my answer was that possibly I could, but I really wanted some dedicated materials to stay year round in the world language classroom. And we were able to, with that grant, get the supplies that it would take to grow a garden and to get kids outside. So consider what are some solutions that you might come up with for addressing um, the challenge of having materials on hand. Another idea is space. If your classroom, you notice that world language classrooms are generally smaller than science labs. That's just a fact. If you're teaching and kids are learning in your world language classroom and you don't have room for either these supplies or the types of activities that you'll be doing, you need to consider what are some alternatives that you can do. Can you borrow the science lab for a period? Can you go outdoors? Is there an area outdoors that you can use? Another thing that comes up occasionally, I have not experienced it in my current institution, although I have experienced it in other institutions, and that is the idea of turf wars, where a teacher might say, why are you doing my content? Or especially if they have like a sort of big reveal or some exciting thing. Like let's think of like kindergartners with hatching monarch butterflies. If that's the magical moment of the kindergarten science classroom, and you're doing that in your Spanish class, doesn't that take away some of the oomph from that kindergarten science classroom? So that's something that needs to be worked out and negotiated if you want to continue to have good relations with your fellow faculty in your school. And then I hinted at this a little bit ago. Planning time might be a difficulty. If you're trying to plan with other teachers in other disciplines, they may not even be in your hallway or even in your building. That could be a challenge for you to get together and to plan. So you'd have to come up with some sort of a way to address that. All right. So now, um, you know, all of this is great, but Are your students going to be tongue-tied? Are they going to be challenged because they don't have the tools that it takes to communicate in the target language? So I just want to look briefly at our responses from the last um, turn and talk where I had you coming up with some of the barriers to teaching STEM topics in the target language. There could be like a whole slew of things where vocabulary could definitely be an issue. Some terminology might be difficult even for teachers. Amen to that. The understanding of the topic, um, getting through the curriculum to prepare students for common assessments. Yes, maybe you don't have time to do that, or maybe you need to rethink the way that the the assessments or the curriculum is written. Do you have time to plan and implement? Yes, yes, yes. Time is always people's big, big concerns. Students' background knowledge and being able to make the connection to the target language. Yeah, another person mentioning the assessments. Okay, great, great responses there. And yes, these are all great, valid challenges that we all face. Okay, so I'm now going to go through some strategies for keeping language and content comprehensible. So one of the categories deals with linguistic strategies. This could be paraphrasing, using familiar language, slowing your rate of speech, adjusting your tone of voice, re-entering new language. These are all language-based things that you can use in order for students to understand. These are just best practices of making language comprehensible, whether it be the horrible unit on teaching school supplies or teaching something really cool about rockets in your world language classroom. But the whole idea of paraphrasing is an amazingly powerful tool, and it really helps model for our students how they can interact with language, where they can take some really dense language and restate it in a way that's simpler, uses simpler words, and makes it much more pared down and accessible for more listeners. Familiar language is a great way for students to circumlocute, to restate something using perhaps simpler words that they already know. Of course, we know uh, things that we do with our voice, whether we slow the rate down that we're speaking or changing our tone of voice using inflection to help students understand what we're doing, perhaps to draw attention to certain words in what we're saying. And the next category is extra linguistic strategies. These are the things outside of language that we might use. I am a huge visual learner, so these are the ones that I really gravitate toward. And they pair really nicely with those linguistic strategies that we just rattled off a minute ago. So these extra linguistic strategies could involve using things like visuals, props, gestures, giving context, informing students of the objective. So for the visuals, I know a lot of people use PowerPoints, or in my classroom, I'm very big on having things, printed out, laminated with magnets on the back so they can be on the board and be visible. With doing STEM type things, having props, very important. I do a fun lesson on sinking and floating, which sort of leads us to talking about um, math with my pre-kindergarten students. And this is all props. It's just stuff that I found outside. I have a big bowl of water and various objects that I have the students first estimate or give a prediction what they think will happen with these various items, whether they'll sink or float. I try to throw some weird ones in there. If you get a pumpkin or a watermelon, they always think it's going to sink because it's so heavy, but in fact, they float. And I just gather many things that I find on campus or around the classroom or in my office for them to uh, hypothesize, really get them thinking about that scientific process, and then to actually perform the experiment. And this is really simple language where they just say, I think it floats. I think it sinks. And we don't really even necessarily worry at this level about all the names of the objects that they're doing. With higher levels, you certainly could do that. Gesture is a very important uh, strategy that teachers use to make language comprehensible at any level. It really helps. Context, so important that a student knows the context of whatever they're dealing with. And so you've set the stage as a good teacher where you've perhaps done some sort of an anticipatory set or something to get them in the frame of mind to think about what you want them to think about. This could be just placing the objective on the board, or it could be showing a picture of where we're talking about. Right, the next category is interaction. And these could be clarification requests, verbal and nonverbal comprehension checks, and question sequences. All very important in the language learning process, where we don't just say, "Do you understand what I'm saying?" No, that's a horrible question because everyone always says yes. So you need to ask questions where you get some sort of an answer that shows what the students understand what you're talking about. And if they don't, then that's our moment to reteach what we've done. Great formative feedback that we're getting there. And these checks could be either verbal, with you asking a question that would elicit a response, or it could be a nonverbal comprehension check in which you're having your students point to something. They could be doing a thumbs up or a thumbs down based on whatever you've asked them. Um, you could have them show you something, whatever. But it's important for us in that process of rendering language comprehensible to really check and to understand if they are getting what you're talking about. So I'd mentioned using images. What I think is really important for us is for us to use the images and the graphic organizers that are the same as those that are used in the content area classrooms. So an example that I can think of is that when we're teaching the water cycle, perhaps in a unit that we're doing on water on the planet Earth, that you would use a similar diagram of the water cycle from the science classroom. Um, if you can't find one exactly the same, you could change the language yourself or just strive to make it look somewhat similar because students will take that knowledge from that first experience and transfer it over to the second experience in our world language classroom. And it just helps some learners really make those connections a lot stronger and a lot faster because they are so similar that there's no disorientation going on because you've sort of changed the paradigm there. Another thing you can do is hold students accountable for using the target language in class. This is a very important thing for us to do, really striving for getting them to respond appropriately in the target language in whatever response to whatever prompt that you've given them. Teach language in functional chunks. This is so important. Instead of having words in isolation, group them with the words that go together with them. It makes much more sense. And when students are retrieving them from memory, they're actually bringing out the whole chain of the words in the chunk versus just the individual words. And then another thing that we can do is to establish an environment where students feel comfortable to speak. This is so important in any world language classroom, not necessarily one that uses STEM as a focus for their teaching, but you as the teacher have the important obligation to make sure students feel comfortable and safe to express themselves. Now, that's a little bit bigger than just having a disposition of a teacher to be willing to accept incorrect answers or mispronunciations, but to really invite the entire community of the classroom to lean into those differences of student expression and to be accepting of those incorrect answers or mispronunciations or students who struggle to uh, complete a train of thought entirely in the target language. We want to encourage them, of course, to do that, but we also need to make sure that they feel safe to be those risk takers and to try out new language. So I am a huge fan of using various linguistic scaffolds to help my students be successful in acquiring the language. Now, this might vary depending on what your situation is. I am blessed to have a classroom. I didn't always have one, but now that I have one, I really make use of the environment by providing environmental print, such as word walls, for my students to always have the ability to access while we're learning so that they forget a word, they can go look at it. And it's just a helpful tool, and they all use it, and it's so, so helpful for them. If we were to provide word banks for students, that is a way to scaffold for them to be able to access language before they have finally acquired it. Or another thing we can do is to provide sentence starters or sentence stems, which are fragments of sentences that perhaps start off one way and then we leave an ellipsis so that they are able to fill in the rest based on whatever the prompt is. Or forced choice questions, which are a favorite of mine with my novice level learners, no matter what age they are. When you're asking the question, to gesture with one hand, one response, and then to gesture with another hand, the other response. And so they're hearing both possible answers. So they're knowing that they're able to choose one of them and use that as their response. And then finally, modeling is of paramount importance for our students to really receive enough input in order to get to the point to acquire the language and then to give us the output that we're looking for. So here is a sample of my Spanish teacher colleague in our primary school. This is a little chant that comes from a song that she uses with her kindergarten students when they're talking about botany and how plants grow. And notice her use of visuals. So, soy una semilla, I am a seed. So she's got a really large apple seed up there. Vivo en la tierra, she's got a pot or a couple of pots and some dirt. Ponme agua, she's got a rain cloud with rain. Dame sol, picture of the sun. Y me verás crecer, a plant growing up. And so she uses these props in class while she's going over the chant with the students so that they have that reference of what those various nouns are, semilla, la tierra, agua, sol, so that they have that visual cue going on to help them. So just very, very powerful to have all of those visuals there. So I'm now going to have one of the people at Washington Lee to put on this video that incorporates the song lyrics that we just saw. So if you could switch over to the video, please. Okay, here we go. There seems to be some difficulty that we're having in showing the video. I can share that on my wiki after the fact, but oh, here we go.
Soy una semilla, vivo en la tierra. Dame agua, ponme sol y me verás crecer. Soy una semilla, vivo en la tierra. Dame agua, ponme sol y me verás crecer. Soy una semilla, vivo en la tierra. Dame agua, ponme sol y me verás crecer. Dame agua, ponme sol y me verás crecer.
Great. Thanks for showing that for us. Much appreciated. Um, I will point out, I think there was a little bit of lag between the audio and the video of that particular song. But you get the point where you've got a little bit of animation going on there, and the students are able to see it in action. It's a very simple song. It's got like 5 verses there, or 5 lines, so it's really simple for students to acquire. All right, we can switch back to the main slideshow, please. Um, and again, these are words that the students have been learning all throughout the unit, and so this song has made that language just even more accessible. So the reference for that is Carolina Gomez from Fun for Spanish Teachers. And I think she also uses Spanish Together is also another name of her materials. But um, it may seem very simplistic, but I think even for older learners at the middle school or even the novice level of high school, uh, it's a little infantile as far as the song and as far as the graphics go, but I think it gives us language that's very helpful for them in their acquisition process. So now I'm going to show you some pictures from my experience. One thing that we do in our kindergarten, the French students have a French garden that we maintain, and the Spanish students have a Spanish garden that they maintain. And so we start off in the springtime growing seeds using these little seed pods, these jiffy pods, and then the students keep um, keep track. They keep data based on what they see and what they measure. So one thing that we do is at the beginning of class, we just take a moment for them to quickly draw what their plant looks like and then the size of it. So here we see Ainsley's plant growing along. And here's another data sheet here where we see that the students are measuring that. So this helps us reinforce our numbers at this very young age of kindergarten. I can see older students doing this as well. Really interesting stuff. If you think about at the middle or high school level, you could even talk about different types of fertilizers and how they might have an impact on plant growth. You can measure the difference between one set for one type of fertilizer and one set without a fertilizer, etc. So just more data collection here as we go on through this springtime. What we do with this particular class is, these are not kindergartners here, these are older students who are helping with the growing of the garden. This is just getting it ready and transplanting the seedlings that they had done in class. The kindergartners, they get to take their plant home, and then we also have plants that we keep at school. So the Spanish garden, they grow marigolds, and then they grow all throughout the season until fall, and then they actually cultivate them and use them in a Dia de los Muertos ofrenda, like an altar that marigolds are a common flower of. This past year, the Spanish classes grew us. They had tomatoes, onions, jalapenos, and cilantro, and then they made salsa in the fall after everything had grown really nicely. The French students at my school, they grow lavender and sunflowers for their garden, and then they integrate that with art and look at various paintings from French painters who painted those items. So one thing that I enjoy about our garden is that we get to look at it at various points throughout the season because it's right outside our classroom and the students walk over. So on the left-hand side, we see the snow, the winter version of it, and then on the right-hand side, we see the early spring before we've done our planting, where everything gets kind of flattened down. Um, and we really try to involve many grade levels. So here we've got um, older students, I believe these are fifth graders here, picking jalapeno peppers, and we uh, donate some of our items to our dining services who incorporate them into our foods that the kids get to eat. But we do have some challenges when we do our gardening. Our first year that we did it, we did not have very good soil in the garden, and it dried out every day, it seemed. So we were constantly having to ideate solutions to our challenges and come up with ideas to help make the soil better. We also have a fair amount of critters on our campus, even though we're in a suburban area, but we have some resident groundhogs that um, really have a flair for eating jalapeno peppers, even though they're not supposed to. Deer are another concern. So the students decided to engineer a type of fence you might have seen in the garden pictures for a way to keep out the unwanted friends from our garden there. So what I'd like for you to do now is do another talk and turn and talk about with your neighbors and then share in the chat box, how could a garden unit support your target language, whatever your target language might be. So take a moment and let's do 2 minutes and share your answers in the text box, please. Thank you. All right, so your chat time is up. You can continue to put in the answers in the chat box. Let's see, and I'm curious to see what other languages would like to do. Oh, I love the Latin classes putting plant names and origins. Interesting stuff. Yes, French classes talking about Monet. Marigolds for Dia de los Muertos. Very good, yes. And one thing that we did with our sunflower seeds this year after we collected them in the fall is that we put them in bird feeders that we have on campus so that we were able to be responsible um, helpers for the various wildlife on campus. I do have to say, when we were having the attacks from the groundhogs and the deer, those really worked their ways into our stories in the classroom. We had a name for the groundhog. We made a sign to keep the groundhog away. And we would just tell crazy stories about the groundhog, even though he was eating the Spanish classes um, food. Um, it was nonetheless interesting to talk about him and to imagine that he was a Mexican groundhog that was far away from home. We had a lot of fun at that poor groundhog's expense. Yes, I like the idea of using the commands to cook and prepare the food from the garden. That's definitely what the Spanish classes did with our um, salsa garden. Very good. All right, we'll keep those ideas going and we shall continue on our way to stay on track with our time. So I wanted to give an example um, of another item. This comes out of very common elementary theme of life cycles of various creatures. This is of the life cycle of a chicken. And we do not have chickens in our world language classrooms, but our science class does. And they are very generous and gracious and let us come observe their chickens, where we talk about various aspects of the birds, but really talk about what are the right conditions for them. It's more than just like what are the various steps of this life cycle, but really what do they need in order to be successful? And then if they're not successful, what are some solutions that we might have? And that involves, making ideas for very special incubators that are very reliable or very warm or etc. So um, lots of ideas there. Um, and here's some more imagery of our life cycles in action. Very common book is The Very Hungry Caterpillar. Everyone loves Eric Carle and his beautiful artwork. And we use this in our first grade classroom as a way to sort of kick off the whole idea of the life cycle of caterpillar to butterfly. So that's a little booklet that our students make in first grade. And here's because they're not really at that point of being able to do massive amounts of writing, they can certainly speak a lot better in first grade. We have them produce this craft in which they visually represent the life cycle of the caterpillar, and then they use it when they're making their video to put into Seesaw, in which they narrate the various steps of the life cycle there. So that's a great visual prop for them to use in lieu of having to write what they're talking about. So I just wanted to give a couple of resources, and these are on the wiki that you'll be able to find at the end. One of my favorites is Maracas uh, Spanish programs for young learners. The ideas in there can certainly be adapted to other languages, which I have done for French. Um, there are two books in this series, but one is specifically on las ciencias. And there is a disc that does accompany it that has songs that have all sorts of great songs that help our learners acquire the language better and faster. Um, because of just the amazing properties of song and rhythm and how it helps learners so well. But the activities in here are all very accessible and very fun to do with your students. Another curriculum suggestion that I might give is from Global Language Project. They have a wonderful 6-year plan from kindergarten all the way through 5th grade, uh, where science and STEM are the focus of some of the units. They also have social studies based ones and language arts based ones and arts. But the science ones are really fantastic. So this is a picture from one of theirs dealing with forces in motion, which really approaches everything in a sort of experiment sort of way that gets the students to first learn the vocabulary and the various grammatical structures and then apply them when performing the experiments and playing around with them. So that first one that I'd shown you was on physics. This is a matter one where we've got, um, oh, that mistake that I was telling you about, where we talk about what happens, um, when we, apply something like heat to ice, what happens, and the changes of the states of matter. So that covers it for the science. And there's definitely much, much more that you can possibly talk about in your um, various institutions. We're going to move on to engineering now. One thing that I like to do is to do engineering projects that have some sort of a literature base. The research tells us that if there is a narrative structure present, that students are much more engaged in the process. And so that narrative could be, oh, there's children in Peru um, who are hungry and don't have access to clean water or whatever. Um, that could be your narrative, or you can use stories as your narrative. So, Strega Nona is a common children's story, and although it is set in Italy, we do it in the French classroom, where the uh, big problem of the story is that the town is being overtaken by pasta, and we need to rise to higher ground to do so. So this is a really cheap engineering project that you can do with your students, where you give them a finite supply of pieces of spaghetti, marshmallows, tape, and string, and that's all they can use in order to make some sort of a structure so that they can rise up and avoid being flooded by the spaghetti in the town. This is the spaghetti tower is a very common STEM project, but it gets students to work together to come up with a solution with their fixed amount of materials. So, I've often seen people do the spaghetti tower challenge, but there isn't that narrative structure present. And so, if we can get the kids to buy into wanting to save the town or to save a central character, it's much better than just saying, do this task. Another engineering project that we do with our students is to build, this is a pre-K classroom, is to build uh, various houses for our three little pigs. And we even have, if you see in the bottom left-hand corner picture, um, we even have a wolf, which is a blow dryer with a wolf mask on it. And we use the wolf to attempt to blow down the houses and to see if the pigs are going to be safe or not. So we give various supplies to different students. So we have a straw house that's being built by one group, we have a wooden house being built by another group, and then we have a brick house made out of Legos, not real bricks, made by another group. And we test to see which house is the sturdiest. And then if one house doesn't particularly work, then we come up with an idea of changing that house and modifying it and seeing if it will work better depending on the modification that we implement. My school is really big into the design process, and so we get kids to do more than just think about and do something, but we really have them do that ideation and the planning and then the building, and then we also add in the whole testing component, and then the rethinking about it and retrying. Um, this plays in beautifully to growth mindset. It's really a mantra here at our school. We don't like to use the word failure, we like to use the word non-success. So if we don't have a success, we just try again. And it really helps build resiliency and grit in our students. Um, and I love to see that in action in other places. So we'll just do a quick little foray into incorporating math into your classes. This is a first grade class where they're learning about various fruits that we have here at home, and then fruits in other places. We tie it to the Caribbean um, for our French and Spanish classes so they can make those comparisons. But one thing that we do to incorporate math as a sort of school-wide initiative, we are a very STEM-focused school, and so the fact that world language is incorporating math into a first grade lesson is really happily received by both parents and administration. So, again, it's just first grade. They're very early in their language learning process, but this is just another way for them to see the relevancy of world languages and how math and world language can be friends and to work alongside each other. So they're performing math problems using the names of the fruits that they've been learning about with very simple math there. This comes from a second grade unit where we deal with pet care. And one thing that we wanted to add into it was a data keeping where we count the number of legs that different types of pets might have. And then we've got, some outliers there with fish having no legs and etc. Here is an example that I also do with my second graders. They're learning have a unit where they learn about winter sports. And so these are sort of very simple math problems, word problems, where they need to read and process various things related to winter, whether it's counting something or doing some logical reasoning. It's a precursor really to problem solving, but it gets them on their way to thinking about problems. And here's another example of problem solving. And then from my first graders, they have a little Winter Olympics and Winter Olympic clothing unit that we do. And we wanted them to graph because graphing is a skill that they work on in math in the first grade. So we wanted them to do a graphical depiction of how many items are in something. So we have them do graphing in this manner. So the next thing that I want to talk about is doing a Gouin series experiment. These were popularized by François Gouin, who is a French education guru who developed a method for language learning. If you've read Curtin and Pizzola's Languages and Learners, this comes straight out of there. They're big fans of it as well. But basically, to create a Gouin series, there's various elements that need to be present. The first thing is that there's an introduction to the scene where you're stating what's going on. And then you use very concrete action verbs. These work really great as giving a demo or having somebody show how to do something, giving commands. And there's definitely one specific context. You're not all over the place. It's like it could be baking a cake. That could be your Gouin series. And there's one tense. You keep it all in one tense, whether it be present or whether it be, whatever. I like to keep them in present tense to keep it simple. 6 to 8 statements. It's very short. It's very tight. It's not rambling. And it's best to use some sort of props or visuals. If you could have the real thing available to do it, that's great. And then there's a logical sequence there. And what's great about that is that you can then use the statements that you've created here and use them in some sort of a sequencing type activity with your students. So the way you go about teaching a Gouin series, it's very teacher uh, centric in the beginning, and then just like with the gradual release of responsibility, we do it together, and then we, at the end up with the students uh, sort of owning the experience in the end. So in the beginning, the teacher may present orally using pantomimes and gestures, using the props. Then the teacher repeats orally, the class pantomimes with the teacher repeats orally without the pantomimes, and then the class does the pantomimes. The teacher repeats orally, the individuals pantomime, and then finally the class repeats orally and pantomimes. And then uh, the individuals, certain individuals, the stronger ones in the classroom, would lead the series, and then finally you could get everybody sort of leading the series. But what's great is you can have some possible reading or writing activities as extensions to the Gouin series. So here's an example that my Spanish teaching counterpart does in her classroom, and she titles it Pasos para plantar una flor. And so her steps are pongo la tierra, hago un hoyo, tapo la tierra, pongo mucha agua, espero, 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 y veo una hoja verde. So it's a very simplistic way, but it goes along with our botany unit that we do. So they've done the song, and they've seen various visuals, and now this is a great way when it's time for them to plant their seeds in their pots that they're going to eventually take home to do a Gouin series in order to make that happen. So I had mentioned earlier that I do a sinking or floating lesson with my pre-kindergarten students. So again, this could also be done as a Gouin series where I could ask the question, ça flotte ou ça coule? Je verse de l'eau dans le bac. I put water in a vessel. Je prends des choses diverses, une pièce d'argent, un bouchon, une pierre, etc. I take various diverse things, such as a piece of money, a cork, a stone, etc. Je prévois que blanc va flotter. Je prévois que blanc va couler. So here I'm making my predictions. I think that this item is going to float. I think that this item is going to sink. And I actually have a big mat that I put on the table where I have two columns, and there's a picture that shows something sinking and a picture showing something floating. And the students actually will take those items and set it in that chart where we guess what is going to go on. And that gives an opportunity for them to sort of agree with what another student has done or to disagree with what a student has done. And so we teach them, and this is something that even our science specialist has difficulty with in my school, is that students often don't understand the value of doing this prediction phase in um, the whole experimental process because they always see if the results don't corroborate the prediction, then they think it's a failure. And we try to teach them that that is not at all the case, that it's really just part of the process, that you must first make that hypothesis and then go through the work and then find out whether you have the results align with what you originally thought might have happened. And it's just a very hands-on type activity that my students really get engaged in. And like I said, this is a perfect segue into talking about, um, you can talk about matter, you can talk about weight, you can talk about density of things, you can make it much more complex for older learners, definitely. So what I'd like for you to do is take about 4 minutes now, and what I'd like for you to do is talk about how a Gouin series could be implemented in your teaching environment, grade level, or language. And let's try to keep like a sort of STEM focus with that. So I'm going to just set a timer for 4 minutes, turn and talk with a neighbor about how you could set up a very simple Gouin series with a couple of different steps, and then we will reconvene in 4 minutes and share out some of your answers. 4 minutes starting now. All right, so our 4 minutes has elapsed. I was wondering if the site coordinators could type in just maybe some topics that people have generated when they were paired up in their turn and talks. It's really quite open-ended. You could do so many different things with the Gouin series, but it's a really um, practical way to show language in action and make it very concrete for the students. And it's wonderful if you have access to, whatever props or materials might be needed because the students could physically do that, and it's such an engaging way to keep their hands busy and to involve them in a real life thing. Okay, it looks like somebody's answering and saying that their elementary team uses a process similar, okay, for the life cycle of the butterfly. As if any of you know Diana Zuckerman from New York State, she has a really cool sort of uh, process for showing the life cycle of the butterfly. It's a song, but there's also gestures that are associated with it. Okay, it looks like some other answers might be coming through. All right, well, it looks like there's some typing going on, so we'll just let those answers come through. You can certainly feel free to continue to type them in and add them into the chat box. Thanks for those of you who participated. All right, so before we wrap, I just wanted to kind of go over a few things. Uh, the wiki page that I will give you has some resources listed on it, such as the Maracas Las Ciencias, the Global Language Project. Um, those are both available in Spanish. Global Language Project also has Arabic and Mandarin. Definitely check out Helena Curtin and Caroline Pizzola's Languages and Learners. Excellent, excellent resource, no matter what level of students that you teach. And do note that the Wiki Spaces is retiring in July, so I will need to move those resources, but they will be safe from now until July. So help yourselves to what is there. And then again, I've got some items on my Pinterest page that you can check out. So before I take your questions, I just want to review what our learning targets were for today, just to see how we did. So hoping that you can walk away saying that you can state why content-related world language instruction is impactful on student learning, that you can also say that you can choose age and level appropriate themes for your students, that you can plan how to implement STEM integrated units in your educational context, that you can lead a Gouin series for an experiment or engineering demonstration, and that you can identify sources for leading STEM integrated world language instruction. So now is the time, if any of you have questions, I would love to entertain them. So work that out with your site coordinators for typing in the questions, and I will try my best to address them. While I'm waiting for them to come in, I'll just talk about some of those resources on that wiki. There's some really fantastic uh, engineering type activities that you can do with your students that are written in the target language. So if you are a high school or post-secondary teacher, these are really great, great, great references that you can use, where it has a lot of verbiage on the page where you can have the students read what the supplies are, and then you can go through and perform it. It's got the various steps for what you need to do, and they're just building simple things, but it's broken down step by step, and it's really a great interpretive task for your older students to be working on. So we have one question from Chesterfield County. How much time and how often do you see your students? Do you find it a struggle to complete an engineering challenge within your allotted time? So my students, pre-K, that's a 15-minute class. Kindergarten is 20, first and second, and third grade are 25 minutes, and fourth and fifth grade are 30 minutes. So like in the case of, say, the us building the Three Little Pigs houses, that in a 15-minute class that would never happen. So what we do is we negotiate with their classroom teachers to get some extra time. We don't do that a lot, and our schedule certainly could not accommodate doing it all the time, but for certain things, that's like our big culminating thing that we do. after having read and performed the Three Little Pigs in the target language. Um, we see that as a valid use of time, and their teachers are very supportive of it as well. Okay, somebody said, will we receive the PowerPoint? I have an older version of it on the wiki already, and then after we conclude, I will post it on the wiki as well, so you can um, copy it from there if you want, or download it from there, and perhaps Flava might be able to share it too. But you on the last screen, I've got the wiki address, so you can copy it from there. Let's see what other questions. PowerPoint. How many times per week do I have the world language classes? So pre-kindergarten is twice a week, and then everyone else is 3 times a week except fifth grade, and they are 4 times a week. And I will just type the wiki address in right now, just to, since we're not on the last slide yet, and it's a shortened one, so it's not too hard to access. So it's tiny.cc/STEMWL. All right, we have a little bit of time left. Does anybody have any other questions? All right, here are the crickets. So before we end, I would just like to leave you with some parting words. And these are really the parting words that I give to teachers embarking on anything really. And so the first is take it slowly. Try one unit with one class and see what it's like. See what the student experience is like, see what your experience is like as the educator in charge, and refine. What did you do right? What did you do wrong? What could you do better? And one thing that I have done to my folly is really jump in and just try too much at one time. And I think it's really important to take it slowly and try one class at a time. So I think that's really an important thing. So another thing is to remember to keep the language comprehensible by using um, all the great language teaching techniques that you know that you're doing. And that's just really an important thing. Also, foster connections. Talk to other world language teachers. Talk to people in your school environment or outside of it, and make those connections with your science, your math teachers, your STEM coordinators. Talk to anybody who can help you out. I just typed in the longer version of the URL, and hopefully that will work for you. You can test that out before we leave here. I said foster connections. And be a lifelong learner yourself. I had mentioned the example of when I was doing something for a unit on states of matter, and the way I was depicting gases was not quite accurate. I got called out on it by a colleague, and yeah, burned a little bit at first, but I leaned into it and accepted I'm not a scientist. Um, I just play one occasionally in my classroom. So I definitely have that growth mindset, that I didn't get turned off and said, "Oof, I can't do this." But instead I said, well, tell me more. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. Tell me what I can do. So um, I've leaned in, and I've tried a lot of new things with my students. And it's been very rewarding for both them, but also for me too, because I've gotten to learn a little bit better for us. All right. So, everyone, that is it. So, I would like to thank you so much for your time this evening, for coming out on a dreary winter day. At least it's dreary in New Jersey where I'm from right now. And you know, really reach out to me if you have any questions, and I would love to entertain any questions or any discussion. I think it's really the right way for world languages to head to um, really show that content can be the not only the center but at the forefront of our instruction. So thank you very much and have a good evening and eventually a good weekend.